In this video, let's work on the features in artifacts. Find all artifacts, add a new artifact, update an existing artifact, find artifact by ID, and delete artifact by ID. So let's go to IntelliJ. To work on some new features, let's create a branch. We're not going to work on master branch, so let's create a branch. Git branch. Let's call this artifacts CRUD. Git switch artifacts CRUD. So now we switched from master to artifacts-CRUD. Okay. Well, first, let's create a Java class to model artifact. Right-click. First, we're going to new a package. We're going to put all the models or domain models under this package called domain. Now, in domain, let's create a class called artifact. Artifact. Okay. Let's have artifact implements serializable. Then what are the properties of this artifact? Well, I don't know. Let's take a look at API. Remember, API documentation must be done before you start writing a single line of code. So let's go back to Swagger. We scroll all the way down. There are models. So let's take a look at the first model. In artifact, there are 4 properties: ID, name, description, and image URL, and they're all strings. Okay, so let's go back. Okay, next, let's create getters and setters. Then let's create an empty constructor. All right, we're done. This is our model, artifact. It is a POJO, P-O-J-O, plain old Java object. It only has 4 properties: getter, setters, and a constructor, and no business logic. Let me close this. Next, we're going to create 3 packages: controller, service, and a DAO. And in each package, we're going to create a class: controller, service, and DAO for artifacts. So under this package, let's create 3 more. If you still remember the picture I showed you, the 3-layered architecture. So each package corresponds to a layer. So there are many ways you can develop. You can go from controller to service to DAO, or the reverse. So let's start with controller. Let's create a controller for artifacts. Let's call it artifact controller. And we're going to use annotation add controller. But this time it's different. Since we're using REST API, we're going to use something called REST controller. REST controller is a kind of controller, but it can do more than a regular controller. I will explain the extra features offered by REST controller later on. But for now, we're going to annotate our class at REST controller. Okay. Now remember, for each REST API, we're going to create a method in this controller to handle request and respond to this request. So let's go back to Swagger. As you can see, under these artifacts, there are 5 APIs. So that means we're going to create 5 methods in the controller class. Each one corresponds to one API. So let's start with findAll. And the request mapping should be /artifacts. And this is also a get, right? So get mapping. Artifacts. And there are no path variables. So simply just /artifacts. Okay, then what is this result? As you can see, I'm trying to use a type that I haven't defined it yet. Later on, I'm going to define this result under domain. Well, this result represents a return value from the backend to the front end. So in the result, normally we're going to have a flag, true or false, right? A code like 200, 201, or 400, or 500, and so on and so forth. Also a message that describes this code. And in the end, we're going to have a data, which is the payload. If it's findAll, this data has a list of artifacts. You have seen that I use result in some previous projects. To save some time, I have already copied a result from my previous project, and I will paste it under domain package. Paste. Okay. All right. I pasted 2 classes. One is called result, one is called status code. So let's take a look at the result first. As I said before, in result, there are 4 properties: flag, code, message, and data. And data is the request data. For example, it can be a list of things, or it can be one thing, and so on and so forth. And we probably do not need this one. Then let's take a look at status code. In status code, I define some static final private fields. The first one is success is equal to 200, then failure is 400, and so on and so forth. You don't need this class, but I think it's really a good habit that one company or one organization have some agreed upon response code. And here, I'm just using HTTP response code. For example, 200, 400, 401, 403, and so on. Okay. So let me make sure I import it. Okay. Next, the controller is going to call service and ask service to find all artifacts. But you know that service is not going to talk to database. Service will in turn talk to DAO and have DAO talk to database and retrieve all artifacts. And then return to service, service return to controller. Right now, we haven't created service, so we cannot move on in controller. Let's create service. Let's go to service package, right click, new a Java class. I want to call it artifacts, artifact service. We should also annotate this class. In Spring, the annotation for a service class is, not surprise, service. Also, it is recommended to use a second annotation called @transactional. Do you still remember transaction in database? This annotation will make every method that we define in this class, artifact service, transactional. What does it mean? It means that we will treat each method as a whole. A method has to either happen in full or not at all if one line of code in that method has a problem. So it is always recommended to add this @transaction annotation to a service class. Now, let's work on the method that find all artifacts in this class artifact service. Public, and this method is also called find all. And it returns a list of artifacts. But we know service is not going to talk to database by itself. Instead, it will talk to DAO and have DAO get all the artifacts. So we got stuck now because we haven't defined DAO yet. Okay, next, let's work on a DAO class in DAO package. Right-click, new class. Well, this time we're not going to create a class. We're going to create an interface. So let's call it artifact DAO. This is the place where interaction with database occurs. As you have seen in my previous projects, for example, expense tracker or find users, the DAO layer usually consists of a lot of boilerplate code that can and should be simplified. Spring Framework, and to be more specific, the module called Spring Data, takes this simplification one step forward and makes it possible to remove the DAO implementations entirely. It's amazing, right? In order to start leveraging the Spring Data programming model with JPA, a DAO interface like this one, Artifact DAO, needs to extend an interface provided by Spring Data. It is called JPA repository. So let's do it. Our interface extends JPA repository, the first one here. This interface requires two generic types. In this case, we will pass artifact to the first generic type and pass string to the second one because the type of our ID is string. Artifact. So that means we're going to do CRUD, C-R-U-D, on artifact. The second one is string, which is the type of the ID. Remember, every artifact must have an ID. Are we done? Yes, we're done. That's all. That's all for the code in Artifact DAO. By extending this JPA repository and passing two types to it, we got all the CRUD operations for free. Spring Data module will actually automatically create implementations for my Artifact DAO. So in summary, by extending the interface, JPA repository, we get the most relevant CRUD methods in a standard DAO, Artifact DAO. All right, then we can close it. We're done. Let's go back to service. And once we finish service, we'll go back to controller. Okay, so in service, we need to make Artifact DAO available. Okay, so we can define this DAO as a private field. Artifact DAO, Artifact DAO. And inside this find all method, we're going to use a method in Artifact DAO. It is Artifact DAO dot. Okay, look at here. Remember, by extending JPA repository, we got those methods for free, and Spring Data would provide implementation. We, as developers, no longer need to write a single line of SQL. That's why we really love Spring Framework. And in this case, we're going to use find all. But I just want to show other things. Find by ID. We also get find by ID. We have find all by ID. We also have save. We have delete. So all those CRUD methods, we get them for free. Now this time, we're using find all. Next, let's go back to controller. Remember, controller depends on service. So first, let's make service available in this current class. Same thing, we're going to define it as a private field. And let's call this artifact service. Then we can use the find all method from artifact service in this controller. So here, let's use artifact service dot find all. And as you know, this find all returns a list of artifacts. Next, we're going to package this list of artifacts in result instance, and then serialize it into JSON and respond to the front end or the client side in this case. Okay, so let's create an instance of result. New result. Then what do we put in this result? Now remember, a result has 4 private fields. So let me show you this. Flag, code, message, and data. We know that we're going to put the list of artifacts in data, that's for sure. But do we put true or false here? What is the number we put here? And what is the message we put here? We don't know. Let's go to API documentation. So let me toggle over to Swagger. So let me click this. So if everything is okay, the heavy path, this will be an example of response. As you can see, this is true, 200, find all success, and this data is really an JSON array. Okay, so let's go back. The first one should be true. Then second is 200, okay? But we're not going to put 200 over there. We're not going to hard code this number. We're going to use a static member in class status code. Status code dot success right here. And this will be evaluated to 200, okay? But I do not want to hard code anything in my code. Because in future, what if I want to change success code to 20,000? Then I simply just change it in one place in static code, and all my other code won't be affected. So this is good programming practice. Okay, next is find all success. And the fourth one is the payload, right? In this case is all. Okay. Next, we're going to serialize this result instance into JSON and return it to the front end, right? Well, in Spring Boot, everything is made much easier because Jackson is built in. So what we should do here is simply return result. Done. Behind the scenes, Spring Boot will automatically serialize this result instance into JSON and respond it to the client. Okay, we're done. No, not quite there. There is one small problem. So let's take a look at this private field, artifact service. And also here, in service, we're using artifact DAO. Do you see any problem? In other words, if you are not using Spring, you simply just launch this code, what error or what exception will you get? It is our best friend, NPE, non-pointer error. Because here we only declared artifact DAO as a member and we haven't instantiated it. In other words, we have to use the keyword new to create an instance of artifact DAO in service. And in here, we're going to use new to create an instance of artifact service. Then we can use object.method name. But we're not doing this. But remember, in Spring Framework, Spring can manage the creation and dependency injection. So how do we do this? we're going to define a constructor for each dependent. So here, we're going to define a constructor. That's all. Okay, that's all you need to do. By having this constructor, Spring will automatically inject an instance of artifact DAO into this class. That's all you do. This is called auto-wire. Same thing here. That's all. But you must have a constructor because Spring Framework is using constructor argument to automatically inject the dependency bean into a dependent bean. Well, in this case, controller depends on service, service depends on DAO. So that's the dependency relation. Okay, so we're done with the programming. There's one small issue here is, where is my data source? Right now, my code works fine, but there's no database, right? So in the previous projects, you will have to download MySQL, install it in a VM or locally, and then figure out user and password, and also, for example, root privilege, and so on and so forth, and have a property file in your project. Then you need to connect, maybe using a connection pool. So it's really a lot of hassle, a lot of things that really not related to your programming. Okay, those are overheads. But remember, the whole point of using Spring Boot is to improve your productivity. The good news is Spring Boot comes with a built-in in-memory relational database called H2. Okay, so let's create some dummy data and insert them into this in-memory database. All right, so let me close all of those and collapse them. On this package, let me create another package, and I will call it data initializer. And on this package, let's create a class. I call it DB data initializer. So the purpose of creating this class is we want to bootstrap some data. So we have some initial data in database, which is this H2 in-memory database. So when we find all, we can find the data that we inserted here. Okay. Now, next what we do is we're going to have this class implements an interface called command line runner. It is also from Spring Framework Boot. And we have to implement a method in this interface. It's called run. So this run method gets called when Spring is run, when the entire application is run. So we really want to insert some data before our client issue find all or something else. That's why this method will be called once Spring Boot is started. All right. Now in this run method, we're going to create 6 artifacts, magical artifacts, and I will insert them into our database. Okay, here is the first one. Artifact A1, new artifact. A1.setID. I have already copied the ID. A1.setName. Our first magical artifact is Deluminator. A1.set description. I have already copied the description. And last one is set image URL. Now, I don't really have an image, so here I just put a placeholder, image URL. Okay, next, I'm going to create more. To save your time, I'll just copy and paste everything in here. So we got 6 artifacts. Okay. Now, those are all Java objects. How do we insert them? How do we save them in database? Do you remember artifact DAO? Yes, we can use artifact DAO.save. Okay. So before we do that, let's inject artifact DAO into this class. Remember, you have to define a constructor. So once we have this artifact DAO, go all the way down here, we can use artifact DAO.save A1 and 2, 3, 4, 5, missing one here, 6. All right. So if this method gets called, we create 6 instances of artifact, and we use artifact DAO to save them to database. Well, if this looks familiar, it should be. In my database class, we talked about how to use Hibernate to achieve ORM, Object Relational Mapping. That's right. Behind the scene, Spring Boot is using Hibernate to do all the work for us. So are we ready to run it? Well, not quite. So if I scroll all the way up, we need to give an annotation to this class. It is called add_component. So we're making this class a component. Basically, this means we're telling Spring, hey, you're going to be responsible for creating this bin and manage its lifecycle. So an instance of this class will be created when Spring Boot is started, and an instance will be treated as a bin. If you still remember that in Spring Boot, there are many bins, right? And we can do injection and so on and so forth. Is this the only bin? Of course not. The controller you just defined, this guy here, this annotation @REST_controller will tell Spring this is a controller, and also will tell Spring this is also a bin. So please be responsible for creating an instance of this artifact controller. Also, this service has annotation called @service, also tells Spring this is a service bin. So there are many bins created, but you as a developer don't have to worry about it. Spring is doing this behind the scenes. And same thing here. Spring will also create a bin for artifact DAO and wire it up in service and wire up service in controller. So in Spring, everything is a bin. Since we're using Hibernate to persist data, if you remember in my database class, you have to annotate your domain object. So in this case, you have to add @entity. Now pay attention. Do not use the entity from Hibernate, using it from JPA. Also, we have to tell Spring which field acts as an ID. Okay, make sure you add the 2 annotations in artifact.java. Finally, we can launch our project. So as you can see, Spring is starting and no errors. Tomcat started at port 8080. Okay, so let's go to browser first. Later on, I'm going to try Postman. Okay, so let's go to browser first and test this one. Get artifacts. Localhost 8080. Now in browser, you have to type the complete name, right? Artifacts. Okay. Now by default, remember, if you type an address in the address bar and press enter, it is HTTP GET method. Okay, so press enter. All right, this is the response. As you can see, here is a flag, code, message, and data gives us an array of JSON.